When Lucas began working on the prequels, he and Rick McCallum decided to use the lessons from the original to do things better this time. As noted, the plans Lucas would lay down for each film would inevitably run into issues once the time came to actually start putting those films together. While it could lead to something good, like the dramatic effect of Vader being the father of Luke, it also led to less successful changes, such as Leia being the sister of Luke. The way to avoid this, they decided, was to not do them as individual films, but rather write, revise, film, and edit all three at the same time. This way, things would fully tie into each other and have a more consistent feeling to them, with no contradictions or plot holes that would demand plugging.
Eventually, it was realized that this plan was untenable. Lucas had far too much to do to write one script, never mind three. So eventually he settled for structuring the story, but only writing out for the first script. As was mentioned in Part 2, the plots were centered primarily around two characters, Anakin Skywalker and Palpatine, the future Emperor.
Since he had decided the Emperor had transformed the Republic into an authoritarian state, and that the Emperor was a Sith master, it meant that the character's journey would not be simple. But that lent itself to potential drama, a political thriller to serve as a contrast to the adventure surrounding Anakin. Lucas had to not only determine how precisely Palpatine would pull off both his rise to power and radical transformation of the government once there, but also the background of the Sith themselves, a group that wasn't even mentioned by name in the original trilogy. Lucas conceived of the Rule of Two as the foundation for this, given what had happened in the original trilogy between Vader and the Emperor. Each sought to remove the other, which was why each wanted to have Luke. Lucas thought that this was the natural relationship between the Sith, that they would ultimately be wary of each other. The lower one wants to gain power, the higher wants to keep it. A third presence would destabilize that, leading inevitably to two ganging up on the third, ergo the Rule of Two. Any more than two Sith at a time, the entire order will descend into chaos. Thus, it was clear why Palpatine would be interested in Anakin, as he would be the means that he could eventually use to eliminate his own apprentice if either the character grew powerful enough to threaten Palpatine, or so weak that he was no longer worth having.
One bit of good fortune was that, having chosen a relatively young actor to play the Emperor in Return of the Jedi, the actor was now old enough to actually play his younger self without makeup. So Ian McDiarmid was brought back to reprise the role, both in political form as Senator Palpatine and in Sith form as Darth Sidious. Oh yes, with the fleshing out of the Sith, Darth went from being Vader's first name to a title.
Now I am the master.
Only a master of evil, Darth.
You can't win, Darth.
The Jedi were likewise going to require fleshing out. The plan had originally been that they were sort of a galactic police force. In the original trilogy, Obi-Wan was dressed in the native garb of Tatooine. You can see that his costume and Owen's are nearly identical, while Luke in Return of the Jedi was clad in the traditional black outfit the Jedi had used. But with the strong spiritual influence introduced with Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back, the spin-off material had gravitated more towards the pre-Imperial Jedi as being a religious order, that keeping the peace was one aspect of their spiritual mission. As a result, the Jedi were to be realized as a kind of monastic order, complete with a belief in resisting forming attachments, which is derived from similar teachings in some aspects of Buddhism, which influenced the training in Empire. This would then help shape Anakin's journey, an exploration of how a good person becomes bad, that he was an uncaring monster as Vader, but Anakin's problem was that he cared too much. Anakin and the Jedi's development led to what would prove to be a contentious addition on Lucas's part, the introduction of Midichlorians as the means through which living beings felt the Force. It was felt by some fans that this scientific approach diminished the more spiritual aspects of the Force. But actually, this was necessary. Training Anakin was supposed to be against the wishes of the Jedi. But if Qui-Gon, and later Obi-Wan, was to train him despite that, he would need to have more than mere intuition to force the Council to accept this. The introduction of midichlorians presented indisputable evidence that Anakin was truly a unique example of Force potential. Lucas didn't add them because he wanted to explain the Force. He added it because he needed something that would force the Council to take action despite their instincts that Anakin was dangerous, that his raw potential was so great that without training he would likely become a threat. After completing his initial Obi-Wan draft and then a second Qui-Gon draft, Lucas continued to refine things until he made a surprising decision. Early on in the production, before Lucas had written a single word of the initial draft, the plan was to have someone, like Kasdan with episodes 5 and 6, rewrite Lucas's script once he had finished it. The man McCallum approached for the job was a former writer on Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, Frank Darabont, who would become famous for adapting The Walking Dead to television, The Green Mile to the silver screen, and the film he was actually finishing up when he got the call from Rick McCallum, Shawshank Redemption. Darabont was very excited about the prospect and quickly agreed to do it. As time went on, though, Lucas changed his mind. One theory as to why was that he felt that he was happy with it the way it was, but this seems iffy given his own poor opinion of his writing. The other theory is that it had taken so long that he feared the damage of stopping for someone else to begin working on the script. In either case, Lucas got some last-minute jitters, and mere weeks before shooting was scheduled to begin, he happened to be with Lawrence Kasdan on a speaking engagement at USC, and he asked if Kasdan wouldn't mind taking a pass over it. Kasdan told him that he felt Lucas should film the script that he had conceived, to ensure that it said all that he wanted to say, though many contend that this was his polite way of telling him that he didn't want the job. For whatever reason, the day arrived, and the script for Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, written entirely by Lucas himself, began being shot. What was also surprising was that Lucas himself would officially direct the film. The plan had also been that someone else would come in and do it, but Lucas had two strong reasons to do the job himself, both closely related. On Return of the Jedi, Marquand was effectively a tool that Lucas used to get the job done, to do the dirty business of directing, but in reality he was heavily involved personally in directing. The reason for that was because Marquand simply didn't have the experience making a film like Star Wars. Lucas needed to hold his hand to get him through it. Well, that was 1983. This was 1996, and the changes made in that time were revolutionary. Virtually all the sets would use blue screen or green screen techniques. Some had almost no actual sets to them at all. Everything was going to be added in digitally afterwards. Return of the Jedi had a director inexperienced with that kind of film. But for Episode 1, nobody was experienced with this kind of film. The most effects-heavy films to come before this dabbled in comparison to what was being demanded here. Titanic had 500 effects shots, plus an additional 400 to do very minor things like removing wires from the shots. Episode 1, on the other hand, would have 1,900 effects shot out of the 2,200 that were in the film. It was so massive, 3 visual effects supervisors were necessary in order to cover the workload. As a result, Lucas figured that it would be similar to the situation all over again. He'd have to be on hand anyway since he was intimately familiar with what ILM could do and how it worked, and how his script was trying to utilize those tools. If he would be ghost directing the film anyway, why not just skip the pretense and just do it himself? But the other reason was that, and this likely was a strong influence, that this all was so unprecedented. Lucas was going to do digital effects, something he had helped push during the original trilogy era with his computer division, on a scale that was without parallel. And some of it was going to be shot entirely digitally rather than with film, an experiment to see if that aspect of their research had reached the practical point for large-scale film production. One experiment in particular was going to be a conversation between Qui-Gon and Anakin, where one side was shot with digital film and the other side with traditional film, and when you splice it together, to see if you could tell the difference. Lucas took a keen interest in experimental film, and that didn't just mean subject matter or content, but how films themselves were made. I would go so far as to suggest that this was the primary reason that Lucas was going to shoot the first film, and the other stuff was just a way to justify his desire to have what his companies had spent 20 years developing and finally get to play with them. McCallum saw this as more than just an opportunity to do things that were impossible before. They were a means the production could use to save money. Building elaborate sets is a problem for any movie, even more so for something as fantastic as the universe of Star Wars. Necessity required far more be built than would ever be used on screen. If a kitchen is mentioned in the script, you built a kitchen, even if it doesn't appear in the scene, in case it's realized on the day that that scene is needed. Ditto building sets larger than needed, extra pieces, all wastes of money there only to keep you covered so you didn't lose far more when you realized the set wasn't going to accommodate your shot. With digital effects, all you had to do is put a screen in position and then fill it in later. Nothing went to waste. The only downside to it was that blue screen was difficult to light without having the color splash, as it were, onto the real things in the shot. So they used brand new state-of-the-art lights that were twice as powerful and wrote special software that could eliminate the blue spill from the film. That's why, while Episode 1's budget was enormous, it wasn't even close to a record breaker. It didn't even break the top 10 of its era. Casting Episode 1 was far different than the original trilogy. Alec Guinness was the recognizable name and face, but otherwise Lucas had wanted less well-known performers. This time was different. Besides reprisals such as Ian McDiarmid and Frank Oz, there would be Natalie Portman, who had gained a reputation as a very talented young actor, and capable of pulling off first younger than her own age, and then older than her own age in later films. There was the Oscar-winning star of Schindler's List, Liam Neeson, cast as Qui-Gon Jinn, and who cost the production $150,000 extra, not for his salary, but because he was such a tall man that they needed to build the sets far taller in order to accommodate him. Samuel L. Jackson publicly lobbied for the chance to appear in any capacity, and was given the role of one of the most important Jedi, Mace Windu, a character drawn from the very first treatment of Star Wars back in the day. And for Obi-Wan, the rumors ran wild, one of which being that Lucas was going to use an image of a young Alec Guinness and digitally place it over the face of another actor. Thankfully, that wasn't even considered, and instead, it went to notable performer in Trainspotting, Ewan McGregor. As for the digital slapstick character, Ahmed Best was brought in to provide the physical performance of Jar Binks. He'd been seen doing a performance of Stomp. That night, actually, someone from out of town who had played his part was being honored by appearing in the show, which forced Best into the background. As a self-described young hothead, he didn't take that lying down and sought to upstage his replacement. Well, his energy convinced Lucasfilm that he was the man that they needed. Remember that this was years before Andy Serkis would become synonymous with this kind of tech. Like so much else, this was a pioneering effort. Having someone very physical could make this process easier. Others were considered to provide the voice for that character, including former Mystery Science Theater 3000 dual performer Trace Ballou. But Best submitted his own performance in the hopes that he could win Lucas over, like Anthony Daniels 20 years earlier, to convince him to let the physical actor do the voice. Best was very excited to be involved, and has repeatedly said that his favorite film of all time is The Empire Strikes Back. He brought to Lucas a voice that he had actually developed while reading from children's books, one that was meant to show a childlike aspect to the character. This would sadly backfire. During production, Rick McCallum took Lucas aside and said he was concerned about how Jar Jar was translating from the page to the screen. Lucas explained it as Jar Jar being a surrogate for children in the audience, children who have fun by annoying parents and babysitters. They would identify with Jar Jar's behavior, especially with the voice that Best was using. While some children did enjoy it, the character would be heavily criticized, and in fact would symbolize all that was wrong with this film and the prequel films, including the accusation that Jar Jar was racist. A point that incensed Best, who felt that it only betrayed a lack of understanding of what true racism in America is. Anakin was going to be the largest challenge, a child of 9, yet capable of flying ships and racing pods. And Lucas knew that was going to strain credulity. But he felt 9 was as old as the character could be to have leaving his mother behind be traumatic, a significant event in the film and a major plot development in the prequel story arc for him. The pod race was there to help with that final battle, to help make the audience more inclined to think that he could pilot a ship if he could pilot a pod. And Lucas drew inspiration for the scene from a memorable bit from the Star Wars radio drama, where Luke Skywalker and his friend Fixer raced T-16s on their native Tatooine.
Look out! Will you shut up and keep... Oh, no, you distracted me, Wendy. Now Fixer's got the lead.
Well, let him keep it. I want to live.
How does my Oscar blast feel, Luke?
Too narrow to get past him.
Tatooine would return, including a trip to Tunisia, which was once again inexplicably hit by a storm that destroyed the set. And also, there would be a visit to the central world of Coruscant, briefly seen in the special edition ending of Return of the Jedi. It would of course play a major role since it was the center of both the Republic's government and the Jedi. The third location, the planet Naboo, split between the forest for the swamp scenes and classic scenes shot on location in Italy, owed some inspiration from an unexpected source. While working on the script for Episode 1, Lucas had an unrelated meeting about an upcoming project. The success of Jurassic Park not only meant that ILM was the place to go for groundbreaking special effects, but also it was the time for realistic-looking dinosaurs. And there happened to be a recent book that was about dinosaurs, which meant the time seemed perfect to make a dinosaur movie to ride those coattails and bring that book to the screen. So a meeting was held with ILM, clearly the frontrunners for bringing dinosaurs to the screen, where Lucas was present. And it was about an adaptation of the illustrated book Dinotopia. While Columbia would eventually shelve the project, pre-production work was already being done, and one of the pre-production artists was Ian McCaig, who was brought over to work on Episode 1 afterwards. The influence of the work is perhaps most clearly seen in the design of Theed City itself, set on a waterfall much like in Dinotopia. But the work also inspired Lucas himself, who brought the book home and began reading it to his own kids, and it quickly became his son's favorite book. There would be a dinosaur theme to Theed, and the ending bore enough parallels that artist and writer of Dinotopia, James Gurney, said that he nearly dropped his popcorn when he noticed the similarities. While Lucas kept silent about it in public, he privately called Gurney to ensure that there were no concerns that he felt he'd been ripped off. Gurney publicly stated that he found it flattering that an artist like Lucas could find inspiration in his work and liked it enough to share with his own family, and that he himself had discovered inspiration from Star Wars back in 1977 while still an art student. Lucas's connection with his own children during his wilderness years may have given him the incentive to restructure things around a childhood Anakin. However, it's important to note just how big of a leap Lucas was taking, putting so much of the film's center in the hands of a child. Words on a page are one thing, but making them mean something, of filling the audience with warmth or sadness or elation, that doesn't just happen. A child actor, by their very nature, is a profoundly limited experience, both in acting and in simply being alive. Children don't often sit around and reflect upon their reactions and emotions, don't mull over communication and things like that. Being aware of that is important if your film depends upon that child's performance.
For instance, let's look at this scene in the aforementioned classic science fiction film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Now, the child that you're seeing here is only 3 years old, yet in this scene he expresses surprise, quiet concern, comfort, shock, and then a growing bemusement. Again, 3 years old. How did Steven Spielberg direct a kid of an age when getting through the day without a nap was a sign of triumph? He knew what his scene needed to have, and he devised how to get that performance out of his actor. In this case, it involved one person dressed like a funny clown and another dressed like a gorilla who takes off his mask to reveal that he was a person the actor was friends with. Figuring out what you want and how to get it from your actor applies especially when the actor doesn't have the professional or life experience to get there themselves.
But that wasn't Lucas's style at all. He admits that his approach is a, as he describes it, European one, where the director's job is to tell the actor what to do, not what to feel. Terence Stamp, who took the small role of Chancellor Valorum for the chance to work with Natalie Portman and with George Lucas, didn't have the chance with the former. She was played on the day by a piece of paper on a stick, and expressed disappointment with the latter. I didn't feel he was a director of actors. He was more interested in stuff and effects, he would say. Peter Serafinowicz, who voiced the new villain Darth Maul, also sought direction from Lucas and was told, "Be evil." This is not to say that it makes Lucas a bad director. He is, after all, the same man who was nominated for Academy Awards for directing not once, but twice, and twice by the Directors Guild of America. But it means that Lucas's form of directing was one that had the actors find the character. He was there to facilitate the shoot, not to facilitate the acting. Now, it is certainly understandable why that would bother actors sometimes, but again, it doesn't make Lucas a bad director. It just meant that he was a kind of director that wasn't suited towards pulling character out of the performers. And this is almost certainly the reason that Jake Lloyd, hired to play the role of 9-year-old Anakin, would deliver a heavily criticized performance. He was doing what he was told, including emotions that he needed to do, but his approach would prove very hit or miss. In retrospect, it was the final example about why the revision of Episode 1 had been a miscalculation. Lucas wanted that one moment when Anakin leaves behind his mother to really connect with the audience, and Lloyd effectively delivered that scene. But the audience's ability to connect would depend on whether or not they had connected over the 45 minutes of screen time that Anakin had had before that scene. And this is important. Think about what is probably the most well-known scene in the entire original trilogy. It was Darth Vader revealing who he was to Luke Skywalker. And the reaction Luke had of a huge protest of no could have been hammy. It wasn't. And the reason it wasn't was because the audience connected with Luke by then, had seen how much his father had meant to Luke's own sense of identity. That response is not what we remember of the scene. But it does fit the scene, and we understand how this flips over the table for Luke. For young Anakin, the performance is mostly technical. Marks are hit, reactions are given on cue, lines are delivered competently, but often unimpressively. Lucas was excited to be back making this whole new kind of Star Wars film in this whole new kind of way, enough to be willing to write and direct it. But it was clear that Lucas, the writer, had written a script that wasn't geared towards the strengths of Lucas, the director.